Okay, I guess we'll start. So hi, everybody. I'm Greg Scontras, faculty in the Department of Language Science here at UC Irvine. And on behalf of Professor Judith Kroll, Professor Elizabeth Pena, and Professor Julio Torres, I'd like to welcome you to the second event in our fall series on linguistic diversity. I hope you enjoyed the screening of the film Talking Black in America. Now we're going to transition to a Q&A with the filmmaker. We invite you to use the Q&A function on Zoom to type in your questions as they arise. I'll be monitoring those questions and moderating the conversation. But first, I'd like to hand things over to my colleague, Judy Kroll, who's going to be introducing the filmmaker.
Thank you, Greg. It's my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce Walt Wolfram today. He is the William Friday Distinguished University Professor at North Carolina State University, where he also directs the North Carolina Language and Life Project. His work has been recognized in many different contexts, and I'm going to share some of this with you from his website to not only to embarrass him, but to enjoy this moment together. He has pioneered research on social and ethnic dialects since the 1960s. He's published 23 books, 8 edited collections, and more than 300 articles. Over the last 2 decades, he and his students have conducted more than 3,000 sociolinguistic interviews with residents of North Carolina and beyond. They've had funding from numbers of different sources, including the National Science Foundation. But critically, and as you know from this wonderful film, that Professor Wolfram is particularly interested in how we can translate the sociolinguistic work to the public, how we can connect with the public, how we can be members of the communities in which we live. And he has been incredibly innovative in doing that. He has received a number of Emmy Awards, including one for Talking Black in America. He has also been recognized with many, many different awards, including the North Carolina Award, the Caldwell Humanities Laureate from the North Carolina Humanities Council, and he has been the president of the Linguistic Society of America, the American Dialect Society, and most recently, he was elected into the very prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. All of this is very impressive and very academic, and I think that it's very important that all of us at this particular moment in our history realize that there is more than all of this that's so impressive. He writes something on his website that completely grabbed me and that I want to share with you. He was writing in the way all of us do about trying to attract students to our programs. He said, "Studying language in North Carolina is like dying and going to dialect heaven." Well, Walt, when I read that, I thought, for those of us who work on bilingualism, I felt like living in Southern California.
Exactly.
Dying and going to variation heaven. But I need to say that in what he writes, there is a spirit about life and work and giving back to the communities that we study that really requires us to take a breath and celebrate what we can do to make a difference in the world. And at this time, this particular time in our history where I think many of us often feel quite powerless, I recommend reading his website and reading about his work for inspiration for your own. Please join all of us in welcoming Walt Wolfram for this wonderful, wonderful event and to our virtual UCI.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really an honor. It's kind of interesting because, I guess you'll collect questions and so forth in the process, and I'll just give a little introduction. Because actually my intrigue with visual presentation of ideas linguistics was originally spurred by the Children's Television Workshop, the producers who bring you Sesame Street. Back in the 1960s, when they were just an incipient program, I was invited to be an advisor on their linguistic presentations. And so at that point, we formulated a policy of diversity in the voices of the people on Sesame Street. So probably many of you in the audience grew up watching one of their programs, you know, and actually, as I was just watching the program, I have grandkids who are that age now, but it's really interesting because I've noticed that not only do they have diversity in voices, but they also, even to this day, have become sort of a leading voice of change in terms of their inclusiveness, in terms of their agenda, in terms of representing progressive causes, which include languages, you know, so they have characters from different cultures. They recently introduced an Islamic young girl in the program, and they've maintained that. And to a sense, you know, I often ask people, you know, do you remember anything about Sesame Street? You know, did all the voices sound the same and so forth? And people say, oh, I never knew that. And part of the interest in that is that from earliest ages on, kids and people are aware of language differences, and they make a difference. You know, we've done. I had a student at Georgetown who did some research on voices of kids 3 to 5 in preschool, and they were asked to take a gift, the same gift from different voices, and they consistently favored the white mainstream speaking voice. You know, and so we see that these attitudes do not start when kids are grown up. They start at the very inception of the perception of language. And so that's why it's become so important. About 15 to 20 years ago, a young man walked into my office and he said, I don't know, I just graduated with a major in film studies, and I'd like to do productions. And I said to him, are you any good? And he humbly answered that question and said, well, you know, he said he had a good answer for the question. He said, I think I do good work, but he was also very humble. And that started a program in which we've now produced 13 television documentaries on things that include African American English, Hispanic English in this area. We also have one on different American Indians. We have one on the Cherokee and their sort of threatened language and so forth, which also won an Emmy. And so I think that we're the only linguistic program that has a full-time videographer who's paid for by the university. I also have another videographer who's paid for by grants. So we actually have 2 full-time videographers whose task it is to do productions for TV and for education. And so that's become integral to our program. And so Talking Black in America is not simply is a odd production. It's sort of the culmination of lots of years of effort in doing this sort of project for the general public. So that's kind of an introduction. Ask anything that you want. You know, you can also feel free to ask me, how does a white guy end up producing a film on African American language? And I'm happy to answer that as well.
Thank you, Walt. Yeah, the first comment that we got is from Anna, and she's picking up on this story about Sesame Street and saying that she remembers the skits of girls playing double Dutch and almost hip hop style songs, and she remembers memorizing and chanting them out on her playground as well as playing double Dutch. And she didn't realize then that she was developing an appreciation of the vernacular spoken by many of her friends in her neighborhood in New Jersey and New York. So it seems like the effect is there if you can get that awareness early on, even if you're not consciously attending to it.
Yeah, it is. And it doesn't have to be sort of a special film preaching at people. It just has to be sort of diversity as a part of the natural presentation of life.
Yeah. So I want to remind the audience that you can type in your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. while we let people type in their questions, I first wanted to ask if my co-panelists had any questions that they wanted to raise.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this film. The film is amazing, and I missed it a couple of years ago when it premiered at the American Speech and Hearing Association. I was on a train to LA that, believe it or not, got delayed, right? So
Yeah.
right, how often does that happen? Every day. But I really want to thank you for this. This is an amazing film. While we were chatting, while we were just before we started, you were talking about the importance of language as being centered in this in the discussion around diversity, and I'd love to hear more about that. I think that we often don't include language as a central part of our training and our discussions around diversity, yet it's part and parcel of everything that we do and how we communicate and how we know each other. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about how to push on that.
It's kind of interesting because most universities are like our public university, where we've had a big push this year about diversity and how we are now required to take courses in diversity and have to get credit for them and so forth. And one of the interesting things about diversity is, like all things, it seems, it's kind of been canonized so that we have a set of things that have become part of the official canon. So we all do religion, we all do race, we all do sexuality and gender. But most programs do not include anything about language, which is at the heart of diversity. So actually seeing that, about 6 or 7 years ago, we had there was a competition by the university on diversity so we could get a grant. Honestly, we didn't need the money. We had plenty of money to do it. And we were talking about a couple $1,000s, which doesn't really help anybody. But so we applied for it. And the reason we applied for it is we simply wanted to be recognized by the university. And so we developed an extensive program that introduced everything from a small film about linguistic diversity, where I went to the chancellor of the university. I sent him a text and say, hey, we'd like you to make a statement on diversity. And so that afternoon we went over and got his input, also the director of the diversity program and so forth. And so we've shown that at orientation for all of the new freshmen. We did over 50 workshops with everyone from staff workers, the people who clean our offices, to new faculty, to all of the students. We did lots of dorm meetings. They have sort of like issues in dorm life and so forth. We did those. We developed all kinds of materials, a couple of other videos, and actually won a national award for innovative diversity because we integrated language diversity into the diversity program. But it is problematic because it's not what people think of initially. And in reality, how can you talk about sex and gender without talking about language? How can you talk about race and ethnicity without talking about language? So in a sense, it's one of those things where people have done good work in areas of diversity, but it turns out to be selective and it becomes canonized. And actually the reaction that we've had from people as we did these workshops was, wow, it's nice to have something different that focuses on something we don't know about. So people were very appreciative. Even as I came in, I'm in the office now, no one else is, but as I came in, I saw on the monitor, we have university monitors around the campus and so forth, an ad for the Linguistic Diversity program here at our university. So that's something that is really integral. And if you're interested, you can look up our diversity program on our NC State website. You can see on YouTube our little several videos that we produced to embrace language diversity, and it's become an important part of the university. Now that we've gone through the initial stage, however, I want to make sure that it's not forgotten in the current focus, whereas diversity has become a big issue again. And as I said to the chancellor and to the dean, we have all these programs. I don't see any linguistic program, any program about language differences though. Did you sort of forget about us? So I'm trying to keep us in the consciousness of the administrators who said, that was a nice program. Now, here are some programs that have nothing to do with language, and that's what diversity is in our university. And my point is, no, it's not. It's about language as well. It's integrated to all of these things. So don't forget us.
Thank you. A question from the audience. Megan asks what your thoughts are on how linguistic diversity, especially regarding variations of English, is both a tool of access and a cause of barrier when interacting with institutions, for example, courtrooms, social services, etc. And I know in the film you make this point of highlighting how it can both allow access and also enact barriers.
Yeah, that's the dimension of language that is so touchy, because on the one hand, it can be very positive and give people a sense of identity, a sense of solidarity. At the same time, it can be off-putting. And it's particularly true in the university, because here's the situation. Say, for example, in our university, we attract a lot of kids from North Carolina, okay? And in one of our studies, we decided to focus on kids who came from the mountains of North Carolina, all right? Just a group of kids who have a very different Appalachian kind of dialect. And so we studied them, and actually the questions that we asked them, we did analysis of their speech to make sure that they spoke the dialect and so forth. But we asked them other kinds of questions. For example, we asked them things like, how comfortable do you feel speaking up in classrooms? Are there particular courses that make you feel sensitive and embarrassed about the way you talk and so forth? And we found some results that were really interesting. Here's what we found. What we found was that kids felt much more sensitive about their speech in the humanities and the social science courses, which is interesting because in most universities, it's the scientists who are conservative, right? And the humanities and social sciences tend to be more progressive. But what we found, because they're the caretakers of language, what we found is that they had much more pushback from these departments. And so that was kind of a surprise, because we would expect that people who are more progressive generally would also embrace language diversity, but it wasn't that case at all. And one of the things that shows you is how selective people can be in terms of their acceptance of difference. So we can be very inclusive, on sexuality and gender, and be very intolerant on something like linguistic diversity. And that's really a problem, because we followed that up with interviews with over 85 faculty members. We said, okay, let's do a study and let's talk to faculty members about their language experiences. And the level of both tacit and explicit prejudice about language from some professors was absolutely amazing and scary. that basically, which will also lead me to this conclusion, which is not a nice conclusion, but it tends to be reality, that actually universities have become agents for reproducing linguistic inequality. Not only are they benign, they're not benign, they're actually active in the reproduction of this inequality. And I don't think anybody in the university community really wants that to be the case. We've just sort of inadvertently fallen into it.
Yeah, unfortunately, a PhD isn't always an inoculation from intolerance.
Yeah, listen, I exist in an English department. And English departments are generally pretty prescriptive and are, in a sense, often sort of at the lead of the agency against language diversity. And so I have had sort of lots of discussions. Many of my English colleagues still don't agree with me, you know, but we continue to push this in our first year writing programs, you know, have a session. So for example, our students who often teach writing will show Talking Black in America, and then have students write responses to that film as a basis for discussing sort of descriptivism and prescriptivism and so forth, which kids get to college and they're sort of introduced to that, and it's kind of novel to them.
Thank you. So we have a question now from Professor Brandy Gatlin-Nash. She's also one of our colleagues here in the broader language science group at UC Irvine. And she says one of her major goals is to do professional development with teachers and anyone who has quote unquote power over linguistically diverse children so that they gain an understanding and hopefully appreciation for language variation, African American English in particular. But in general, from other Black people, she's gotten the feedback, girl, don't tell them all our secrets. How do we as scholars educate those outside the Black African American community on the legitimacy of African American English without crossing the line of cultural appropriation?
Yeah,
or something similar, something you've come across in your own work, she asks.
Sure, we've come across that, and you know, and in a sense, it's sort of like on a deeper level, it also raises the issue: is like, what is a white producer producing a film on African American language? Which I do have an answer to that I can answer, and then get to the other questions embedded in that response. The reason that I'm the executive producer is simply because one of the things that I noticed, because I've done research in African American language, but I honestly felt that a Black producer should produce the film, should be the executive director, and tried to push some of my Black colleagues, you know, many of whom I knew as graduate students and younger and so forth. So I followed their whole careers to do a film like this. And after 10 years, no one stepped forward. And I said, how about if we do something like this? I'll write the grant and we'll have an advisory committee. On the advisory committee are 8 of the leading scholars of African American English. By the same token, this is not simply a Black movement, and it doesn't want to be labeled as that. This is a general movement which needs Black and white scholars saying the same message, you know? And so in a sense, I think it's important, and we have several white colleagues who've worked on African American language who are also part of the committee, and we want to present it as an overall project that is reinforced by African Americans and white scholars who work on this. I think that's an important message. You know, now lots of times when it comes up with sort of novice corporations and so forth, like for example, we're doing a Google workshop for all of the people who work at Google, you know, which we've done. We've done this for Turner Broadcasting. We've done it for AT&T and so forth, where we show the film, and in times when we would meet together, we'd have a small group, but then we'd broadcast the whole thing and give them access to the film for a month or so forth. And so it really becomes a joint movement, and in most cases, I prefer that a Black scholar be present and do some of the Q&As, because people sort of might feel more comfortable with that context, and it really is about this talk. And I've noticed a different discourse when African Americans are leading the Q&A. But now the issue of sort of appropriation is, I think that our task is to sort of not exceptionalize African American language. There's a sense in which this is not about African American language. This is about every language variety that is not considered to be mainstream. So, for example, one of the things that we have a film called Voices of North Carolina, which was shown in North Carolina and actually was used in the fundraising campaign for the PBS here, where if you gave $75, you could get a free copy of Voices of North Carolina, which was pretty cool because it's the only linguistic film that you could get in return for giving money. All right, so we did that, but let me point out how we produced it. First of all, we started out with the Outer Banks dialect, which is primarily spoken by Outer Banks people. Then we moved to the western part of the state, where we covered Appalachian English. And then we covered Cherokee and Lumbee English, two varieties that are quite different. And then we included African American language, all right? And a couple of varieties after that. But the point is, with sort of the way we strategized our order of presentation, it's here's a white distinct dialect, here's another white distinct dialect, here's an Indian dialect, and here is African American English, which is just another dialect that has arisen because of the situation existing in terms of oppression. And in that context, I think it's important to see the overall nature of language variation, and it's not simply sort of exceptionalizing African American English as one variety. I think that's important. And I think as teachers, using exercises, for example, that show the systematicity in Appalachian English or Outer Banks English, or Cherokee or Lumbee English and African American English is part of the game, where we're presenting the overall view and not specializing our focus on African American language. And I think that presents a context where I think we are less guilty of accepting and sort of ripping off African American English because it's cool. So that's my approach to that. I mean, I think there is an issue. I mean, the fact of the matter is, in the scenes there is an appropriation issue with African American speech, because in the recording studio where you saw some of the rap and some of the spoken word and some of the sort of rap competitions and so forth, that happens to be the studio where Eminem became famous in Detroit. Okay, so that's cool. But the fact of the matter is, the guy who was our central rapper there is sort of going from small gig to small gig, trying to make a living, while Eminem is making millions and millions of dollars. Now, whatever you think of Eminem, and I think he's a pretty talented person, all right? The fact of the matter is, this is a case where something that was distinctly African-American was appropriated by whites. And we have to be very careful of that sort of thing in terms of our linguistic appropriation as well. That's a long answer, and I'm not even sure I answered the question, but I had fun.
Well, I guess on this topic of appropriation, I wonder, it seems like it's got to be quite difficult striking a balance between preserving culture, of which language is such a huge part, and dismantling stigma and improving access. So we saw in the film the role of isolation in creating African American English. Now, we'd like, I assume, to preserve culture without forcing a total assimilation. but I'm wondering if there's any best practices or advice of how it is that we can address the barriers, improve access, while also celebrating the culture and that linguistic diversity itself.
Well, there's a certain sense in which I feel that this is kind of a decision that the community makes. So for example, on Ocracoke, they have very distinct dialect, and people recognize it immediately. It's the only dialect in the United States. This Ocracoke, by the way, is a small island about 20 miles off the coast of North Carolina, which was settled in the first decade of the 1700s. Still today, the only way you can get to that island is by boat. They have a small airport that in emergencies, people can fly in and they can bring in helicopters and so forth. So we've studied that dialect now for 30 years. And it's interesting because when we first got there, people were kind of suspicious of our motives because they thought maybe we just came to make fun of them. Over time, they trusted us and they now love their dialect. We've educated every kid in that school for the last 28 years. Every spring break, we go down. We developed an 8th grade curriculum on dialect differences, which is accepted throughout the state of North Carolina. You can teach in social studies because in 8th grade, kids study about the history of North Carolina. And so we developed this program for the entire state. We've taught it on the island of Ocracoke. And the attitude has changed from shame to now. In the process, outsiders have taken over the island. Less than a third of the people who live there now are insiders. There's a thriving Hispanic community, and the dialect is dying. And the reality is, as linguists, we would love to preserve this dialect because it's really cool and it's distinct. And it has a history that goes back, 3 centuries and so forth. But the fact of the matter is the people love the dialect, but the young people, because of the social circumstances, don't promote it anymore. So in a sense, it's kind of up to the community in terms of where it goes. And I think there's a certain sense in which African-American English is in the same situation, where you have clusters of de facto segregation. In Philadelphia, where I grew up, there were miles of essentially Black neighborhoods. White people didn't go in those neighborhoods. That actually one of the scenes in the film is of the Brewster projects in Detroit. Now, that project, which is where Diana Ross came from, had 6 tenements of 12 stories each. There were 10,000 African Americans in about the size of a football field, a little over like a football stadium. That there were no white people. Now that is ripe for sort of maintaining and even diverging African American English, which is one of the reasons why it's been diverging, because in the North, there were large segments of African Americans who were so segregated that they rarely interacted with white folks. And it's a perfect context. Now, those folks are not going to give up their dialect. They're just not going to do it. They're just going to keep speaking in ways that are different. And so in a sense, it's their choice whether they sort of take these sort of the road of accessibility, and what's interesting in that context, and excuse me, this is a little bit of a run-on thing, because what has happened over the last 50 years is the whole construct of talking white and talking Black have become quite prominent. So I can't tell you how many times when we were interviewing people on the street in Harlem or in Detroit or in other areas, people would say, well, I know, talking white and the controversy surrounding talking white. So is it an approach of accessibility and accommodation, or is it an oppositional identity to the Black community? So it becomes really an important issue. And before this time, 100 years ago, nobody cared whether you sounded black or sounded white. In the South, they had many shared features, and certain people said, well, do they sound black or white? They sound black or white. But as an oppositional identity, it's much more prominent today. The more you have people integrating, the more the whole construct of talking white and talking black become an important crux of identity. And this is really an important thing in society today. And so in that sense, I think a lot of people are really conflicted. I have professors, African-American professors, with whom I was good friends, for half a dozen years. I never heard them talk black. And then they tape themselves talking to their friends at home and their parents and so forth. And after 6 years of working side to side by these professors, I realized, oh, I'm a colleague and I never saw this speech variety. So I think it's much deeper, much more conflicting in terms of sounding black, and many of the people, sort of the spokespeople on our program, for example, the African Americans, they don't typically talk in vernacular English, but many of them also have access to a variety that they use with all blacks and close friends that is quite different from the one that they teach with.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, Priscilla was asking if you could share some thoughts about your experience making the film itself, and also the film that is brand new, Signing Black in America.
Yeah, well, okay. I found people incredibly gracious and much more tolerant than I would be. We have African Americans on the crew, more recent, and we also have sort of two sets. Basically, all of the experts, white and black, I would interview as sort of the lead expert in terms of the program. Now we've turned that over to a younger African American graduate student of mine who does the interviews. When we first started Signing Black in America, we had an interpreter and I started interviews, and then I said, this is ridiculous. Joseph Hill, who is a black PhD in linguistics, and why don't you conduct the interviews? Here are the questions, and that worked much better. So as a white person, I didn't feel particularly shut out. I think it's more helpful if there is a black person behind the camera or black people as a part of the crew, and we always had them as part of the crew. But in some specialized area of expertise, I probably took more sort of control than I should have. But by the same token, people like John Rickford and Tracy Weldon and Lisa Green are all they've been friends for decades, and so they weren't particularly suspicious. And I have a history with them. All of them I know as graduate students. And so there's a sort of history so that they know that I'm not really there to exploit them. And the advisors were very involved in the final editing. So for example, we had several rounds where all of the editors watched the film and said, get rid of that part, get rid of that. And they argued amongst each other. So I feel that in that sense, it's a very collaborative project.
Can you also comment on the reception that the film has had? It seems like the film is great in that it can reach a very broad audience. There's education, but there's also this celebration of identity. How has the film been received?
I have been amazed. So for example, we're in lockdown now, right? And we've sold a couple thousand DVDs to schools and people in classes and so forth. But just during lockdown, and because And because DVDs don't come across very well on Zoom, I've had almost 200 people who are using the film in their courses who said, could you give me access to a URL so that I can have all of the students watch this on their own and have sort of better fidelity, and then we can discuss it. You know, voices from the middle of nowhere, you know, voices in Europe, voices in Alaska, you know, people had no idea. They just bought the film and they wanted to use it, and we're now handicapped by the fact that sort of we're all teaching remotely and wanted students to have access to it. So I think the response has been remarkable. And one of the things that I've also found was sort of families watching it together. So an instructor will have a family say, well, we watched it together and I wanted to get my husband's or my wife's impression of it and so forth. And I find that it's pretty accessible. I've shown it to all my grandkids who are 12 years old and older, and they really loved it. So it is accessible. And we've also shown it at a bunch of high schools where it's gone over very well. We showed it to an all Black high school in Florida, in Dade County last year. And we had an hour discussion and the kids were lined up asking questions. I've never seen audiences as thankful as they've been. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for showing this in such a positive light and so forth. And when we showed it, all right, we had an hour showing and then we had an hour of discussion afterward. And there were still about 4 or 5 people in line after the hour. And a girl stepped forward and said, I have something for you, okay? And she burst out into this amazingly creative spoken word that was really amazing about sort of oppression and language. And, you know, I quick pulled out my phone and took a copy of it. And I now show my classes, you know, here's a response of a high school kid who saw this film and was so inspired that she got up and did spoken word rap on it. So we've been really delighted.
Great. Next question. So Taylor asks a little bit about personal history. So what got you involved in this research?
Well, yeah, I have a strange life history, okay? In the sense that the reason I got into linguistics is because I wanted to be a Christian missionary, okay? I have to confess that sort of, and back in the days, people wanted to translate the Bible into all these languages, and so you need a linguistic background. So that's how I got into it. But as and I also come from a very working class background. You know, I'm the youngest of 6 kids. I'm the only one of the 6 kids who has a college degree. All right. Several of them were high school dropouts. So we were not educated. My parents are immigrants with an 8th grade education. Now, why is that relevant? The reason it's relevant is because I've always felt that I wanted to do something that made a difference to the places where I came from. And so when I started losing my Christian faith and sort of, I didn't lose the urge to do something that made a difference. Now I became an academic, and so of course I did all the things that that academics do in terms of writing scholarly books and so forth. But I have to say, and I'm going to be 80 next year, and the only reason that I still do this and can't stop is not because I need to write another research article that's, you know, spend two years doing research, write article, 6 people read it, 3 understand it, 2 of them disagree, and you're left with 1 graduate student. Okay. And to a 79-year-old, that's not all that gratifying, you know? But I can't retire while we're doing this series on African American English. I mean, it's going to be a 4-part series. You know, we just finished a segment I'm going to show to the American Speech and Hearing Association on the role of African American language in speech and language pathology. I went up to ASHA. We went into clinics and so forth, and did lots of interesting research. The next one we're working on is on the history on sort of the African diaspora, and we were scheduled to go to Ghana and Jamaica. Unfortunately, we were supposed to go to Ghana the end of March, and it got called off, and Jamaica. But we're going there, you know, and we will get there. And because we think it's important to sort of have something that talks about the African diaspora and the role of language in that in terms of the Middle Passage, we're going to go to Jamaica. So that's really important. We then have another segment. We did the one on Black ASL. And the reason we did that is, okay, so we had a grant from NSF to do 4 episodes after the original one. And so the first time I showed it at an LSA meeting, a young African-American who was deaf stood up and essentially signed, "Why don't you have something like this on Black ASL?" And I immediately turned to him. I said, "You know, that's a good idea. We'll do that." And so that's how that came about. Of course, I taught and did research with Seal Lucas earlier in life. I knew Joseph Hill. And so we contacted those people, went to Gallaudet, and developed Signing Black in America, which has also been a pretty big hit, which in a sense teaches a lot about ASL as well as Black ASL, you know. So my own kid, you know, who has no particular interest in linguistics, that's just what his dad does, you know, said to me, "I thought ASL was universal." No, so there are about 120 languages, and many of them have dialects as well, you know. And so he sat down and watched it and was totally sort of intrigued by what he learned about ASL in general and about Black ASL, which makes perfect sense in terms of segregation and in terms of the solidarity of the Black deaf community. So a lot of this is not nearly as planned, but as responses to needs as they come up.
Okay.
And fortunately, with 2 full-time videographers, it makes it easier.
Getting back to the linguistics a little bit more, Holly asks if you could speak a bit on code switching and how it affects African-American English speakers as well as perceptions of African-American English. She's wondering what sort of side effects there might be of this level of code switching.
That's a really good question, and we try to sort of address it by showing Tracy Gray when she was talking to her mother and recorded it and so forth. The fact of the matter is, well, everyone can shift language based on different contexts, interactions, and so forth. It's utilized to a much greater degree by African Americans because the vernacular language is in some ways more distinct, and because there is such oppression involved in African American English. So there's a sense in which sort of having the ability to be flexible in terms of language use is an important capability. And I would say that generally speaking, African Americans have a much greater ability to code shift than most white Americans because they're in different kinds of situations in terms of asymmetrical power relations. By the same token, there's also a price because in a sense it says, you know, this whole dichotomy between, oh, this is home language and school language. Now, come on, which is superior, school language or home language? So it's not like, and there's also sort of an erroneous notion that you use one language in one context and one language in another context. I mean, the fact of the matter is, people are now much more into what was referred to as code meshing, where they used, out on the playgrounds, and you listen to Black teachers in schoolrooms correcting kids, their variety may be much more vernacular when they're correcting kids in situations involving the school. So it's not this unitary sort of dichotomy. This is what you lose in school, and this is what you and this is what you use at home. By the same token, we just did a study, and the book is coming out, where we followed African American kids for 20 years, a cohort of 65 kids. We started with 88 and then ended up with 65. We have all of their records. We have we had activities in which we tried to force them into simulated code switching, say, we're okay, now the two of you are going to prepare a speech to the parents who are going to come here, as opposed to just sit down and eat some lunch together and just chat. And we have all of their school records as well, all of their standardized tests and everything. It's just an amazing study. I mean, it will never be replicated. But here's one of the upshots of that. One of the things that we found was that kids with higher code switching ability, that is, kids who could sort of switch codes as indicated by sort of the context we put them in, actually correlated with higher reading ability. So that there was a correlation between their ability to code switch and their ability to read, which is kind of an interesting dimension. It's not whether they talk African-American English or not, it's whether they could code switch. So that was sort of an interesting correlation that sort of encourages us to promote code switching, and that it has a utility in terms of learning how to read as well.
Okay, so I think let's have one more question, and I was hoping you might conclude with some thoughts on what you wanted people to get out of this film. So when you sat down and decided, let's make this, what were you hoping people would be able to get out of it?
Be happy to address that. Yeah. Is that what you want me to do now?
Yeah, I think let's do that.
Okay. Actually, there are a couple of things. One of the things that we wanted to do was include language in the celebration of Black life. Okay, so as long as I've been around, we have Black History Month in February. The first 3 occasions where I premiered this film, I asked, and it turned out to be over 1,000 people, has anyone during Black History Month seen anything related to Black language, the history of Black language? Not one person out of those over 1,000 people, acknowledged that they had ever heard a lecture about Black language during Black History Month. Well, that seems a travesty, because this is such a tradition, has such an interesting and unique history. So one of the things we wanted to do is bring it to light, and now I can tell you the month of February, all of it, our advisors have been involved in showing the film and having Q&As, because it's gotten into the history of Black life. And so that's an important thing. The other thing, of course, and many of these people spoke this, is to change the mythology, that this is not a collection of errors, but is a legitimate variety with very complex rules, and is something to be celebrated for its complexity, for its utility, for its functionality, and its representation of Black life. I mean, all over the world today, all languages are using, rituals of Black speech, so there's rap, there's spoken word, and just about all of the languages, which has been adopted from African American language. And this is sort of amazing thing. And this is something to be celebrated. I mean, the fact of the matter is African-American language is giving more to the American English language now than any other variety. And this is to be celebrated. So to change the message from a negative to a positive one is really what and that is why people often thank us. Thanks for doing this, because now we can go and show this and celebrate Black language. So in a sense, it sort of puts a lot into it, but it ends with sort of, this is our legacy, please celebrate it. And that's what we really want to communicate. We want to change the narrative.
Well, let me add us to the long list of people thanking you for this film, also thanking you for joining us today for this conversation. Professor Walt Wolfram, thank you very much. And thanks also to the audience for your participation in this.
Oh, this has been a lot of fun. I love to talk about this stuff. So please, I don't care if you rip off a copy, show it wherever people can see it. People say, how much does it cost to use it? Come on. We make about $7,000 to $10,000, which goes right back into our productions. But this is not about money. This is about getting the word out. And so please, if there's anything that I can do, we have a website where you can order it. But if you need to show a copy and ain't got no money, I can give you a copy. That's not a problem. Just contact me. Okay. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
So much.
Fun. See you guys.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.